welcome back to the second half of Walter Bowart's excellent book, Operation Mind Control. This is, of course, a classic in the world of conspiracy research. It's not based on a lot of speculation. It's very factually documented, has a good bibliography, good has quite a few pages of footnotes. Definitely a lot of information, and even a person who is a veteran to this research, there's quite a few gems in here if you're not familiar with it. If you're new to the topic, it would be a great introduction, and it's a great companion to John Marks's book, The CIA and the Search for the Manchurian Candidate. So we left off talking about the Cold War and how the Cold War allowed the deep state, cryptocrats, the technocracy to really set up a global surveillance system, aka the internet and so forth, under the guise of the Cold War and fighting the commies everywhere. This Cold War intelligence cult was deeply tied to the military-industrial complex and is, for all intents and purposes, synonymous with the deep state. We have a discussion of the founding of the OSS, the rise of the national security state. This led to, under FDR, Bill Donovan, of course, setting up this apparatus to not only influence and police public opinion at home, but also foreign intelligence operations. So in 1942, the OSS is set up, and we have the beginning of the idea of Psy-War, right? Psychological warfare on mass scale, utilizing, now that's old, obviously, but this would be utilizing all the techniques of technology and the sciences then available. We get a very fascinating discussion of operations like the Secret Team. If we think of Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty's famous book, The Secret Team, we have discussions of the operations in Southeast Asia. And in fact, he specifically mentions Prouty, right? And we know that that book had an influence on Oliver Stone in the creating of the JFK movie. So Stone definitely has known about all this stuff for a long time. We have a mention of the Dulles brothers, their role in the founding of the deep state, the idea of the Pax Americana spreading the four freedoms, the freedoms of American freedoms, so forth and so on. Eisenhower's 52 campaign to spread freedom to the captive nations. This was along with Dulles in the background under the guise eventually of the commie threat. So that's all discussed, of course, in my analysis of Tragedy and Hope. There was a whole chapter where Quigley covered the same material. We have discussions of the Dulles brothers and their connections to Sullivan and Cromwell. We've covered that as well. Spook law firms. And eventually Sullivan and Cromwell sent one of their guys to Berlin to negotiate private affairs with German industrial barons before the war. After the war broke out, their agents were sent to Switzerland with the OSS, where undercover they used former business contacts inside Germany to supply information for many spectacular single-handed intelligence coups against the Axis powers. So we have a lot of double dealing and inside operations there, supporting and fighting Nazis. A lot of examples of that kind of stuff in this chapter. I think we all know that, the rise of the deep state is synonymous with the rise of the national security state and the Dulles brothers. We also get, of course, as many people know, connections to the Roman Catholic Church through that realm via Avery Dulles. And I remember back when I was a Calvinist, one of the first books I picked up by a Roman Catholic was by Cardinal Avery Dulles. And I was interested because I heard that he was an Augustinian or a Calvinist of some sort, I think, who had converted to Catholicism. So that was interested me because I also was a Calvinist who was on the verge of converting to Catholicism. So Dulles, of course, was known for his modernism, his support of Vatican II. He wasn't in any sense a traditionalist. And I still have actually quite a few Dulles theology books. So I've read multiple, at least two of Dulles' books on theology. I think Models of the Church is one of the ones I read many years ago. And even then I noticed this is kind of like a, liberal whitewash of the doctrine of the church here. But regardless, you can see obviously the connect. People have been noticing these connections for a long time, right? It wasn't just, Wim Hof is who has really documented it in his book, but other people have made these connections and noticed this. So we have a discussion of the idea of containment, the Cold War containment policy of the deep state, which actually allowed for a lot of the buildup. The discussions of the Soviet threat being exaggerated, and the admission by the CIA that absolutely we subvert these other countries. Now, who doesn't know this? But I guess at the time of these admissions in the 50s, this was shocking to some people. I don't know. But touching on the Greek issue, this is interesting. Although the Cold War generally is said to date from 1948, the Berlin blockade and the Greek Civil War, John Foster Dulles contributed to its architecture before he came to his office in 1953. He epitomized the fearful gestalt of his generation and took hold of the floundering Cold War strategy and molded it into his personality. He was fond of quoting Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers that safety from external danger is the most powerful director of national conduct. The fear-based safety approach. So that's why we have such a impetus to create fear and then to manipulate the population, is because that's seen to be the most effective means. But the downside of that too is that it also leads to other conclusions, like, well, in that case, we also ought to dumb people down so they don't think about anything, they don't investigate anything. This gets into the whole history of American education, which myself and many others have covered. R.J. Rushdoony's book is really good on that. The Messianic Character of American Education is a classic on that. I would argue it's better than John Taylor Gatto, because even though Rushdoony was kind of a goofus and a weird character, he at least understood the religious impetus and motivations of the people who had adopted the idea of William James and basically the Unitarian Universalists who were behind setting up the American education system and the adoption of a behaviorist modes of psychology, psychologism, Skinnerism, operant conditioning, J.B. Watson, et cetera, et cetera. That's all the basis for the American public education system. And when you look into what's the guy, the Unitarian Universalist guy who's famous for, I just went blank, but you can look him up. I've got a whole article on it, Public Education, Mass Brainwashing, where I just quote all these guys, basically. Anyway, so Horace Mann, John Dewey, Horace Mann. Horace Mann was the famous Unitarian Universalist. Deep State. The Cold War, according to Boert, he's correct, I would say. He says it is World War III. It is waged by the deep state. Technocracy is their goal. They engaged in a lot of black ops throughout the Cold War. That's what was going on. Absolutely. Yep, my uncle flew surveillance missions and maybe other things during the Cold War. So I know that's true. He was a Cold Warrior. And flew out of Turkey over Soviet space in the case of my uncle. Now, the Cold War transitions the U.S. into the global police, of course, the army of the globalists, the army of the deep state. And again, it's a very appropriate and very interesting that Boert has consistently referred to them as the cryptocracy. And he talks about how the way that the cryptocracy functions is because of military-style compartmentalization and the idea of need-to-know basis. Nobody needs or gets information unless they need to know. And this is how large-scale things are kept under the wraps, right? Manhattan Project, same way. They're very similar, he says, to secret societies, and in fact, the deep state and the intelligence agencies come out of secret societies. Absolutely. The black budget, we've talked about this many times, the Pentagon's black budget regards the secret funds that have been going on forever. And it operates like a giant machine, he says. It's a robotic-style deep state that is supremely efficient, basically a big business. And that's why it's all black budget, right? So you can't trace the funds. You don't know what they're up to. And the way that they get everybody to go along is compartmentalized information, keeping everybody dumb, not making connections between this thing and another thing, and appeals to patriotism. Yeah, exactly. I've talked about that in multiple lectures. Don't question any of this. If you do, you are a traitor and you're not patriotic. Now, wait a minute. It would take about 2 or 3 minutes to go through some basic logic to figure out on what basis should I agree to morally opprobrious actions on the basis of patriotism, when patriotism is itself a dubious concept, given the fact that the deep state is a private for-profit and mind control operation, right? So in other words, there's not a whole lot of moral force to this argument when you really deconstruct it, when they just try to blandly appeal to patriotism. But this is what's for the low levels and the dummies and the mass man and the corn-fed middle American, right? Die for your country, don't ask questions, shut up, dummy. And he says, now in the case of individuals in the deep state or in the giant government bureaucracy, the way that the control works beyond the compartmentalization of knowledge is that you have the appeals, number one, to patriotism. If that doesn't work, then people are bought off. If buying them off doesn't work, then they are blackmailed. If blackmail doesn't work, then they can resort to more serious measures, such as assassination. You have an unhappy, unlikely accident. The deep state and the national security are the servants of big business, and they always have been. The old boy network is who makes up the retired cryptocrats. And the way that they function in terms of the presidency or the executive is that they falsify intelligence reports and news reports. Absolutely. Such as what? Weapons of mass destruction? Yeah, everybody remembers this one. And again, Bowert's writing his book in the 70s, so nothing new with the weapons of mass destruction story. The ideology that motivates the deep state is technocracy. Absolutely. Fully in line with what Quigley writes in his famous chapter in the middle of the book on managerial society. And sometimes I can't read my own writing. Something isolate science. I think what I mean is they isolate science for the purpose of being a servant of the technocracy. So science is not about, going to the stars and creating the best, computer. No, it's all serves the deep state, all of it. Now, again, the dum-dums, people out on the street, the people in the universities, they think, science, progress, it's about what, Space Force or some shit like this. No, it's about billions and trillions of dollars. It's about surveillance and control. It's not about progress and benefiting humanity and all this altruistic nonsense. And anybody who thinks that it is just naive. World War II gave a lot of impetus to this R&D and the movement of the deep state towards technocracy, the rise of the computer, et cetera, et cetera. And this led simultaneously to the idea of tying this all in with mind control. Again, how many times have I told you that it's all connected? It's not separate plans and programs. The Atomic Energy Commission is not over there doing its thing, separate from what the Navy is doing with weather control and HARP, separate from what the CIA is doing with mind control. No, of course not. It'd be very naive to think that. And again, over and over and over, all these books really just serve to show those connections. all of the books that we go through and that we read, by the way, they really just give us a kind of angle, right? A kind of one side of the pyramid, maybe. And over time, you get to see the full pyramid. You get to see the full mountain, right? You're climbing up the mountain. You get to see a little more of the valley. You get a little, you get up to the top of the mountain. You can see the whole landscape. But I do appreciate that he makes that very point towards the end of the book, which is that all these seemingly disparate programs and research and development and weapons trafficking, all this kind of stuff, weapons modification, it may seem different, it may seem separate. It's not. It's all part of the same stuff. And the goal is scientific mind control. And scientific mind control has been a goal since the 1930s. However, as science has advanced, much more time and energy has been shifted towards focusing everything towards the goal of the completely controlled individual. Why do we want a completely controlled individual? Because that's the best way to create the society that the technocrats want. Now, I mentioned earlier my talks and essays, the essay that I did on public education, which cites a lot of the socialists and atheists and Masons and Unitarian Universalists that set up the public education brainwashing system in America. And keep in mind that his chapter is about Brave New World and the Skinner box. His chapter is about psychology at the service of the deep state and the CIA. And guess what? It's all the same people that I mentioned in my article, isn't it? Skinner, Watson, Pavlov. Yes. So even though these individuals, Pavlov being the premier ideologue of the Soviets, it wasn't any different with Watson and Skinner. Skinner, of course, being a Rockefeller man, as we learned in Estlund's book. And Skinner said, I can completely control individuals through modification of the environment. Here we get the complete physicalist, psychologist, materialist, reductionist perspective that everything is external. This is a little strange, by the way, because I would think that Watson would have been aware of the idea of genetics and the idea of what's in man innately, but no. Skinner is Watson and Skinner apparently weren't concerned with that. They were completely on the side of nurture in regard to the nature-nurture debate. Of course, we know, obviously, it's both. But the left has always said that man's problems are external. The left has a blind side to the inner problems of man, the nature problems of man. They only will conceive of it as social, external, environmental factors that are the problem of man. When in reality, this is a false dialectic. Man's problems are both internal and external. In fact, the external problems can affect and change man's internal problems as well, right? Just think about living in a toxic environment will eventually cause the inner man to erode, right? You might, if you live next to a toxic waste dump, your body's gonna erode. If you consume a bunch of garbage externally speaking, that's going to affect the inner man, the soul, or the spirit, right? So there's definitely a symbiotic relationship here between the two, but these idiotic schools don't understand. I'm speaking here of the behaviorists and so forth. They didn't understand that their presuppositions about metaphysics, namely that the world is only, say, material or physicalists, they didn't understand that their presuppositions would affect their whole methodology. But that's because they don't study philosophy. So operant conditioning, of course, becomes the byword of the Skinnerian tradition, and this is where we get the idea of Clockwork Orange style stuff with, strapping people down and reprinting them, rewriting them, rebooting them, Dr. Ewan Cameron style stuff. And Skinner came up with the idea of the box, that he could put people in a box and control them that way. He did this to his own daughter, and when they said, "Why are you putting your daughter in a box, you psycho?" he said, "Well, it was a spacious box." And he said the idea was to create socialized kids. So basically torture, enforced evolution. Right? It's all justified. Why? Well, we saw this in the Arthur Kessler book, and we saw it in the Bertrand Russell book, and we saw it in the Jonas Salk book, didn't we? What did we see? We saw that their actions are all justified. Why? Because it's at the service of science, and science is in the business, they claim, of speeding up evolution. Right? Now, I said this a long, long time ago. People made fun of me, said it was crazy. Yet, what do I hear the top technocrat priests saying? That very thing. And in fact, Boert will say that very thing when he quotes Jose Delgado. Dr. Delgado says that all he's doing is being an instrument of evolution and speeding up the process. So you may think that it's cruel to do these things. You may think that it's against the ideas of human ethics, right? Humanitarian approaches to science, but that's all garbage. It's just evolution anyway. So the Cold War releases the cryptocracy on the world, Boert argues. I think that's true. And so whether it's Pavlov in the Soviet Union or whether it's Skinner in the U.S., doesn't matter, because it's all the same atheistic, materialistic, operant conditioning. It's all the same stuff. The Cold War is a giant Skinner box for humanity of operant conditioning on the world. Absolutely. So he goes on to mention the CIA, the use of the Vacaville facility. We've heard of that many times, many writers, David McGowan and others. And so really the idea here is that since both the East and the West are based on the assumptions of materialism, it doesn't really matter, right? Behaviorism is just as acceptable and approved in the Soviet Union as it is in the West, because both East and West, capitalist, communist, are grounded on atheistic presuppositions. And both believe in the plasticity of man. That is, we saw this concept from H.G. Wells when I covered The Island of Dr. Moreau, which is the idea that man is not actually a being with dignity or made in the image of God. He's an evolutionary aberration, a universal abortion, and thus free will is really just a problem. Emotions are just a problem. Love is just a problem, as Bertrand Russell says, to be overcome. And so what needs to happen is that man needs to be socialized, right? And that is to be put into a dystopian Brave New World scenario whereby he is easily controlled and docile. Again, this is what every one of the technocrats say, every one of the globalists in the Globalist book series say. It's all the same. They all say this exact same thing. No divergence on this point, from H.G. Wells all the way up through to Jacques Attali. It's all about creating the docile, controlled individual, the golem, who will fit perfectly into the global hive brain. He even talks about as we saw in Esterlin's book, the possibility of driving the public mad. That the crypto behaviorists, he's speaking of the behaviorists and the cryptocracy, benefit actually from driving the public mad. And if you saw at the beginning of the talk here, I included the couple clips of Dr. Delgado with his famous bull experiment. And I think that you get the idea here, right? I mean, it's not just bulls, right? That's what's publicly known. Oh, they're just experimenting on bulls. So what? It's just animals. No, it's much worse than this. And in fact, they experimented on humans and have for many, many, many years. And now Boert backs this up, by the way, too, is that he says that all of this studying of the individual psyche in these MKUltra experiments wasn't for creating assassins. It was for controlling the mass mind. Absolutely. So then we do have, however, a very fascinating chapter on hitmen and assassins. And he says it's not really the CIA that was into this, but it was, in fact, the Navy. And in fact, in the last few years, we have seen quite a few news stories that have come out about naval individuals who seem to have gone nuts in some degree. Some of whom claim to wake up in other countries, They know languages that they never learned before. People think that they are being targeted. The naval shooter, I think, there was claims of this nature. Well, regardless of what's true or false in those cases, we do have a pretty hefty line of examples of doctors who did work. He speaks here of a Dr. Narut, that this was reported in Lieutenant Commander Dr. Thomas Narut, 1975, in the Sunday Times of London, granted articles about the creation of killers. And he says that they do have an assembly line of assassins. And the main reason for the mind control, the audio-visual desensitization programs, and so forth that you see in, something like Clockwork Orange, is number one, to break down the taboos of the person, and not so much to have to give them a mission that they wouldn't do consciously, because there are plenty of people who will consciously kill. In fact, Boert makes that argument I've made. There's not a problem finding people who are willing to kill people. He said the problem is that they don't want those people to remember what happened. So the mind control research had to do, in the case of contract killers or hitmen or assassins or snipers or whatever, had to do with the plan to wipe the mind such that they could not reasonably be suspected of lying when they were interrogated, right? Because, polygraphs, this kind of stuff, if the people secretly did remember, it was much more likely that they might spill the beans, that, oh yeah, well, I was sent, by the government to kill so-and-so, and that was, even though that's illegal, right? So in other words, just wipe these guys' minds. They don't remember. So he talks about how all that was done. And what these desensitization programs did was that they would create a kind of brutal individual, the kind of James Bond individual who doesn't have any qualms about killing people. And this was done through desensitization, making them watch really brutal stuff. Now, guess what? That's exactly what all these nasty, disgusting horror movies and torture movies do on a mass scale, is that they desensitize people. And I think it's, theater of cruelty, theater of brutality type stuff is what we're looking at here, to mass traumatize the public. And so they did talk about the hypnosis and mind control experiments, and they had success with, it was fairly easy to get people to kill people. Next, we have discussions of speculations on possible individuals. Louis Castillo, who a Cuban Bay of Pigs guy who might have been involved in JFK. Who knows? But the accusation or the suspicion is he might have been under this hypnosis. We also have, by the way, a brief mention of something that I think came up in Annie Jacobsen, Project Camelot, one of the books that I've done recently. There's so much information. Project Camelot came up somewhere, and this was a disinformation counterintelligence campaign in the 60s, sociopolitical analysis of Chile, but was actually designed to keep Chile free from communist leaders by discrediting people. So keep that in mind. Project Camelot discrediting program. Let's see. So now here's a fascinating chapter 2 that ties into a documentary that I watched that was really good on Sam Giancana, the head of the Chicago outfit. And let's see, I did take a little bit of notes on this I wanted to get into, because even though I don't have a specific theory on exactly what went down with JFK, I think we can kind of draw a rough outline that when we consider Jack Ruby being a mobster, well, obviously the mob ties into this, right? So what it looks like is just a rough outline. Is basically the CIA teamed up with the Cuban exiles and the mob to get rid of JFK. That's what it looks like. To what degree it was then obviously politicized into a Cold War thing, Yes, and in fact, I think the deep state was behind the idea that it was Oswald that did it at the behest of the Soviets. So when you go to Dealey Plaza now, which I did a few years ago, you'll see that there is a big tribute to the Cold War, and JFK is like a big martyr, basically, for fighting the commies and the Soviets. So they crafted it into, whether you believe JFK, whatever you think about the incident, it has been crafted into him as a martyr for Western democracy and capitalism against the Soviets. But the irony is that it looks like the Operation Underground, where you have RFK going after some of his cronies and people that his mob connections, and I'm guessing Joe Kennedy is well involved in this. This is partly why there was the MLK, RFK, JFK assassinations. Now, if the assassinations are staged, and there is that possibility, they could serve a deeper alternative insofar as they made these people into martyrs of the left. However, there were significant sectors of individuals who did not like these people. So, for example, there were plenty of mobsters who were not happy with some of the operations going on with organized crime. Some have even argued, in line basically with Servando Gonzalez's thesis, that the CIA was not happy about some of the mobsters making money in Cuba, and that in fact is why Batista, who was going to set up the casinos and resorts in Cuba, Batista was taken down through and his mob buddies through Castro, because they were using Castro as an asset at that time, and we know that he was that Castro was already working with the CIA through guarding the Angola oil fields and so forth. Many argue that him going after Che was part of this as well, that Castro was a phony. But regardless, there's a big piece of the puzzle that has to do with the mafia that I have not completely solved yet. But I do think the thesis, if the JFK assassination is real, and by the way, it's Sirhan Sirhan, in his testimony apparently said that he thought it was fake, that RFK was still alive and he just went somewhere else, and that it was staged. So that's partly why, a lot of people talk about the fakery, that maybe these are staged assassinations. I think it's a bit of a stretch. I've never really had a hard position on JFK. I think that's a good bit of a stretch, but, when you bring the mobsters in, it's not hard to believe that people would be put to death. So basically, after all of this, we notice that Oswald gets crafted into whatever any different group wants him to be. Right? So Oswald is crafted into being a Soviet mind control agent. He's crafted as a CIA mind control agent. And essentially, Boebert discusses the possibility of Oswald as a hypnotized guy like Louis Castillo and Candy Jones. And he also discusses this in regard to James Earl Ray, who, as I was saying in the super chat the other day, I'm not super versed on James Earl Ray and the MLK assassination. I think I read a thing on it maybe 10 years ago. But it does appear that James Earl Ray was very interested in hypnosis, and he could apparently easily be hypnotized. So that is an interesting factor there. But regardless, Oswald was not a KGB spy working for Russia and Castro. And then when we bring in the characters like David Ferry and the wandering bishops who relate to the JFK assassination, then we are getting into the obvious deep state cryptocracy territory. And when we look at the confession of E. Howard Hunt, as Boebert notices, that makes basically three pretty high-level operative individuals confessing to being involved in the JFK event. And that this basically suggests, the fairly obvious narrative that there was the CIA mob plan to get rid of JFK. So I think that's probably what it was. And I've read Michael Collins Piper's book, and if you want to bring in the Israeli side and that the Kennedys made the Israelis mad, well, that's not really against the thesis of it being the mob and the CIA, because they would all be on the same team. I mean, the Israelis and the mob and the CIA are all kind of part of the same power structure. So, then we get into a discussion of Jack Ruby's weirdness, his mob connections, and he wasn't a high-level mob. He was more of a mid-level, low-level mob guy. But what's interesting about Ruby is, if you watch the documentary Momo, which thank you to one of the Jay's Analysis listeners who pointed out the Momo documentary about Sam Giancana, this is where we get into a whole other angle that a lot of people miss, which is that the Chicago outfit became very powerful in Hollywood, and they took over a lot of the unions. This is what you see in Casino. And again, the outfit is not necessarily against or at cross purposes with the Five Families of New York, but the outfit supposedly controls one of the big casinos in Las Vegas, the Riviera. So they made their expansion into Vegas. Again, you see this in Godfather 2. They are connected with the Mo Dalitz character, which is what you see in the movie Casino. And then, let's see, in Havana, Cuba, Batista appointed Meyer Lansky to get the gambling reforms going. If you watch Godfather 2, that's the Chaim Roth character. Let's see, 1959, Meyer Lansky. Let's see. So when Castro nationalized the casinos, this made a lot of people mad, obviously. But it was Jack Ruby who apparently went and got Traficante out of jail in Cuba. So Jack Ruby has this very interesting mob role of getting mobster Traficante out of Cuban prison after the Cuban Revolution. So then Joe Kennedy asks Sam Giancana to help JFK get elected because at that time he had a lot of control in the unions and the Democratic racket. Interesting. So the unions attempted to control. The unions were controlled through Sam Giancana, and then enters in Frank Sinatra. Now, so this gets really super confusing, and I get lost on some of these details. Okay, so because I'm not mob guy, right? I know about the espionage, geopolitics stuff, and I know a little bit about the mob, but I'm not mob expert guy. Maybe we'll delve in the next couple of years more into mob stuff, because that's a whole other fascinating puzzle piece, which is very important to understanding the big picture. And I do have Gus Russo's book. That would be a good one to do, about Sidney Korshak, and all these characters are very fascinating. They all tie in together. Anyway, so very, very likely mind control is involved with Sirhan Sirhan. It's one of the clearest cases where it's well known. Supposedly Truman Capote believed that Sirhan Sirhan was mind controlled. Just an interesting tidbit, side note there. Boebert moves on to discuss the history of the Hashashim, right, the assassins of Islam, and their usage of drugs and religious manipulation. And I think everybody's probably heard of that. That's well-known stuff. And he talks about experiments, and I had not heard this. This is interesting. So remember that movie, The Box, with the Richard Kelly, Donnie Darko director? He did The Box. A lot of people didn't like The Box. I liked it. I did a whole, analysis of The Box that's done pretty good. But there was a study done by one of the deep state universities in 1976. Dr. Paul Cameron, not Ewan Cameron. It's called the Box Study. I think that's it. No, the Button Study, something like that. It says, to Cameron's surprise, 45% of people who had killed before said that they would be willing to push a button that would kill somebody if they could get $20,000. So in the movie, The Box, it's like $1 million. But here it says 25% of those who had never killed anybody said that they would do it for $50,000. So The Box is actually a real psychological study. Now, the next chapter is interesting because we have an interview with a supposed deep state secret team guy. He doesn't say who it is. When you read this chapter, it seems credible. I would say this is a deep state guy. And deep state in the sense of he knows how the foreign operations work because he was part of the secret team. And this guy was supposedly somebody who worked in biochemistry and specializing in tinctures and poisons for taking out people, I think, and a Black Ops guy. So basically he asked this Black Ops guy how the whole system works, and he lays out the whole deep state. And pretty much everything that he says rings true. It's all the interworkings of the deep state as we expect. Just a brief rundown. He says essentially that it's not just the CIA. There's a lot of corporate entities that have a lot of power, even bigger than the CIA. That rings true. He says that most Americans haven't heard of the NSA. Now, keep in mind, this book was written in 1978, so nobody knew about the NSA then. Everybody does now after Snowden, but in 1978, hardly anybody knew about this. So this guy, again, this I would say gives a lot of credibility to this person, whoever it is. It's an anonymous source, because he says that the real power structure is the national security state via the NSA and its surveillance. He says, don't forget corporate espionage, and that some of the biggest corporations in the world have all the same techniques and powers of the CIA, and in fact, it's all the same people. Right? So revolving door. People will go from government into corporate. So that rings true. He says the information that you see in the secret team is kind of what we're talking about here. He says the Phoenix program did create, it seems like he's talking about, he says that they created serial killer assassins. He says that mind control is not something just that the CIA has. It's also used by the FBI and even some police departments. Let's see, what else does he say? He says you don't have to create a mind control assassin because there are plenty of people willing to kill. The reason that you need mind control is to make sure that they are loyal, that they can't be flipped, and that they don't remember what happened. Let's see. He says that secret team work is all true. The real power in America is the deep state, which many of whom are generals, retired military. He says the elections in America are fake. He says that the two-party system is a dialectic, and it has been for a long time. It's not real. He says, this was written at the time that when Jimmy Carter was running. He says Carter is an old boy from the Navy, and he's a perfect figurehead. And he says that he ends the interview by saying the CIA is only the tip of the cryptocracy iceberg. The real focus is ultrasonic and electronic memory study, and that they have search and destroy operators who can erase memories. Wow. So I would say, yeah, that whoever that is, that's a legitimate sounding deep state guy. Then we have the chapter on Delgado. Delgado says that bulls can easily be controlled. I showed you that video at the beginning of this hour 2. Delgado says that I am just an agent furthering our evolution. Yeah, so can justify anything, right? Rockefeller support for Alfred Kinsey. I'm molesting hundreds of children because it's for evolution. We then get into just like John Marx's book, the rise of electronic, biometric, bionic, cyborg tech out of MK Ultra. Of course we do. This is what I've been saying for a long time. And again, these are books from the 70s talking about it. So here we have, again, transition into the ideas of the global brain, technocracy, the internet, all directly connected to MK Ultra. Rand Corporation in 1949 commissioned a study on electronic EMF manipulation of the brain. So it's been going on for a long time. They could, a long time ago, induce amnesia. Sandia Corporation in New Mexico was involved in a lot of this work for the deep state. They could induce orgasms. They started working on cyborgs in the 60s. And they said, once again, surprise, surprise, the Soviets are trying to create a cyborg. So we got to do it first. This is always what they do. It's always the same. Let's see. Then this transitions into transhumanism. You can see the obvious connection here. And even back in the 60s and 70s, they were discussing the brain-human interface. Or excuse me, the brain-computer interface. All the monkey research, we've talked about that. Frequencies, TVs, monkeys staring at TVs. What do the TVs do to the monkeys? Magnetic fMRI scans, reading the brain, mind reading through this stuff. We've seen articles on that recently. There's a section discussing the father of cybernetics, Norbert Wiener, and his mind control research. Again, directly out of MK Ultra. And then he goes on to say, again, remember, Bowert's writing in the 60s. He said this is being conditioned through fiction to the masses through the $6 Million Man. Exactly. So again, we see Terminator, nothing new. Next chapter, he moves on to talk about the skills and advance in mind wiping, amnesia. He says, I think what probably is most likely, the assassination of JFK was carried out by the CIA, some FBI, and the mob and Cuban exiles. Yeah, that's probably what it was. All of the research on how to induce alpha wave states, which is the lower brain wave, is from the Black Budget. Norbert Wiener, father of cybernetics, pioneered that. And we even have a mention of weather modification. Once again, you thought it was all disconnected, and no. You see, because the research into electromagnetic frequencies, EMF, VLF, led directly to manipulating the ionosphere. And Bowert mentions that. Then we get into the manipulation of frequencies and signals, TV signals, and the possibility of where this could go. Where we hear this now, 5G. Microwave technology, non-lethal weaponry, all the same people studying all the same stuff. Then we have a discussion of the stories, and these stories still pop up. The embassy, right? The Russian embassy, the U.S. embassy, they got blasted with microwave waves. So there have been plenty of stories like this, and some of it's real, some of it's fake. But one of the reasons we might suspect it's fake was that the deep state was telling us that we got to study this because the Russians were bombarding our embassy workers at some embassy with microwaves. So we got to study how to have the best microwaves to cook people through non-lethal technologies. Then we have a discussion of the dangers of the rise of technocracy and how the plan is by these old Cold Warriors to eventually erect a technocracy to suppress the will of man, echoing Bertrand Russell, to erase free will, and to create AI. And then when AI is introduced, we will have biometrics, we'll have Terminator, and we'll have the end of free will. Then we have a weird suggestion, which somebody should, I would imagine the Collins Brothers' new book will go into this pretty in depth, but nobody has really gotten into the connection between UFOs and aliens and mind control MK Ultra. People have touched on it, it's been hinted at, but there's a couple pages where Boert kind of goes in that direction. He talks about Uri Geller saying, oh, my belief is that we're entering into some new period when, humans will evolve to have superpowers. Look at my spoon bending powers. And this is because the entities from outer space are going to save us and create a technocracy, a utopia. And if we don't do that, we're going to wipe ourselves out. Right? This is the typical line of the technocrats. If we don't let the technocrats rule, how many times have we seen that in the Globalist book series so far? If they don't rule, man's going to destroy himself. The whole human race is going to be wiped out unless the technocrats rule. And we got to have smart cities. So we have actually a prophetic statement from Erich Fromm, one of the Frankfurt School characters, where he warns of the creation of a mechanized society, the removal of free will, and the cryptocracy setting up a deep state. We have discussions of biometric experiments with cats. They created a biometric spy cat. I'm not joking. They claim it didn't work very well, but they also discuss the possibility of techno-eroticism, blah, 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 sex bots. Yep, that's coming. That's already here. So this book was very accurate and very prophetic. So I'd say that's another reason why, the testimony here, the attestation in the Boert book rings true, is because all of its projections and foresight as to what's coming, just like John Marx's book, are correct. Now, Boert, it appears, if we look at this article here, at Media Monarchy, Walter Boert, Operation Mind Control, you can go find that. Boert seems to be one of these kind of lefty type guys who, freedom man, maybe a true believer in the hippie revolution. And, some people have said he's a dubious character. Well, dubious or not, and whether John Marx is dubious or not, most of the information in the book is accurate. I'm not really seeing a whole lot that's outlandish. It's all pretty prophetic. And he even discusses a little bit about predictive programming, where he says that there's sitcoms even that are promoting the coming technotronic age and the imprintable microchip, all that kind of stuff. So the last chapter is this. I think this is the last chapter, chapter 20, National Security, the science of secrecy, where we are under a deep state, and mind control was never about creating Scarlett Johansson killers, but rather for the masses. It's about mass manipulation. The center of this is the military-industrial complex. They are all the Cold Warriors, the neocons, and they basically view their technocracy as a new religion. Now, Boert doesn't mention transhumanism. I'm not sure why. Maybe he hadn't heard the term or something, but that's essentially what he's saying. He's saying there's a cult of intelligence and surveillance and tech at the core of all this, and it's viewed like a cult, like a religion. And I would say, yeah, it's called transhumanism. And it's from the Huxleys. And he says, basically, Victor Marchetti outlined this, what the goal is. The goal is to create a technocratic world government, and it will depend upon whether or not people oppose it, or whether they just put it into place. And then he includes a couple documents from the CIA about fear-mongering about the Soviets, and the possibilities of creating fake guilt in subjects using hypnosis. Just basically one of the many, many, many mind control documents that could be in the book, but particularly relates to the erection of the Cold War fear as the justification for the erection of the giant surveillance deep state. All right, thank you. That is Bowert's book. I'll give it, out of 5 tinfoil hats, I'll give it 4. Easy read, fairly quick read, 300 pages or so. Mostly rings true, prophetic. A lot of elements that kind of play off of and build on John Marx's book, which is also good. Which a shorter book, actually. I think John Marx's book is about 200 pages, but yeah, definitely worth reading if you want to read it. I would say it's worth it, and we see again all the same patterns and all the same warnings of the modus operandi of the deep state. Thank you for listening, and God bless you guys.